Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Tanks with CS. It's been a while unfortunately, but I'm glad to have you back. Anyways, today's video is going to be more of a tank analysis and review video versus, the more eclectic and, gameplay focused video we're used to previously. And the tank in question today is actually the American Tier 9 tank destroyer, the T30. I guess for players who have been playing tanks for a while and know all the little things about the tech tree, the T30 is very much a notable tank. For that, this is essentially the lowest tier American tank, or tank destroyer quite frankly, that features a 155mm gun, which, in comparison to many of the other guns along the tech tree, especially, at lower tiers, this gun has tremendous amount of penetration and damaging power, as in alpha. Almost 280mm penetration and 750 alpha, to be exact, if you will. Aside from that, the T30, especially in comparison to the turretless or conventional tank destroyer alliance tanks along the American tech tree, is also notable for having a fully functional turret. I guess that's what makes this line special and notable, considering the vast majority of tank destroyers in tanks are turretless, or they kind of rely on a casemate, or much rather their gun is kind of mounted fixed to the hull. So in a sense, those tanks have less flexibility in various tactical situations, and more than anything, they probably have to rotate their hull to aim their gun, and that kind of makes them clumsy and vulnerable in certain situations. But I guess one of the reasons why I started doing this grind and ended up with this tank, as well as all the other tanks along this line, such as the T20 prototype, a tier lower, is the fact that I wanted to move forward with tank destroyer missions and take some rewards and hopefully earn some I guess the perks from those missions. And I guess I'm just one of those people who felt that I would do better with a fully functional turret, especially in high tier situations. Because obviously, if you're used to mid-tier, low tier gameplay, you're used to tanks like the Hetzer or the Stug, and if you're familiar with the meta for mid-tier or low tier, not having a turret is not a huge problem. But as with high tier, not having a turret is potentially a huge problem, if you will. But sure, the T30 has a turret and it's more flexible. You can position your hull and your gun separately. You can make better use of hard cover and soft cover. You can get the most out of various terrain features and debris and obstacles to better protect yourself and position yourself and engage the enemy. I guess in a more educated manner, if you will. This tank's ultimately not really all rainbows and butterflies. One way to look at this tank, the T30, is the fact that the T30 is essentially a variant of the T29 and T34 heavy tank. Because ultimately these tanks came from the same design program, and they very much share the same basic design blueprint, if you will. If you look at them closely, they essentially have, very similar hull and very similar turret, to a point that they're essentially almost the same. But the issue is that you have to realize the T34 is a tier 8 premium heavy tank, and the T29 is actually only a tier 7 heavy tank. So, in other words, the T30 essentially has a hull that's relatively vulnerable and not sufficiently protected, and much rather poorly performing for a tier 9, regardless of its own classification and its other performance attributes. Sure, a lot of people argue that this is a tank destroyer, and tank destroyers can play second line, can play Overwatch, and can snipe and be more of a standoff fire support platform as designed. But ultimately, on one side you have to realize on tanks, we're dealing with many corridor maps. Something like Himmelsdorf, something like Ruinberg. Obviously, as you can see right here, Kharkov. So these maps kind of forces you to engage enemies in closer range, and in order for you to stay safe and best utilize the obstacles, you need mobility.
Enemy vehicle destroyed.
But unfortunately, the T30 doesn't really have much mobility. I suspect the ground resistance value for this tank is absolutely in the toilet. So, even on hard pavement, this tank accelerates very slowly and turns very slowly. And, consider the fact that, the whole armor for this tank came from a tier 7 heavy and the relatively poorly armored tier 8 heavy. Not having a mobility, it's essentially the final straw. That takes away, any sort of viability or usability when it comes to this tank's survivability. Because, if you want to dig into the details, you will see that the T30 only has about 100mm of upper plate armor at 45 degrees, and the lower plate is especially vulnerable at only 50mm and at a similar angle. So essentially, any enemy with 100mm penetration can penetrate your lower plate even if you angle your tank, and your upper plate remains very much vulnerable against guns with 170mm penetration or more. So in other words, even sometimes the 17-pounders or German 75 will go through your upper plate, and your upper plate is very much vulnerable to American 90s and the Russian 122s at tier 7, which is obviously the lowest tier this tank will run into. So that means if your hull gets hit, and if you do get hit in the front, I would say 8 or 9 out of 10 times you'll probably go through, unfortunately. And the side of the hull is kind of vulnerable also. Sure, it's not an M103, because I do believe the side for the T30 does have about 3 inches worth of armor, which is about 75mm. But, that only means, sure, you will stop, the enemies from overmatching you. You have a slight degree of protection against indirect fire, such as artillery or HE spammers or derp gun enemies. But for a tier 9, that's really not enough. And obviously, when your front armor is so insufficient, one of the tactics you're going to be forced into using and you're going to want to use is actually side scraping. But the problem with side scraping is that, you kind of need sufficient mobility to get into position and to reverse and to angle and to allow your tank to turn. But as the way things are, this tank, in a way you can say that it essentially turns worse than even 100. Maybe, it turns about as well as a mouse. Sure, on flat ground and good terrain, you can, hit about 30 to 35 km/h in a straight line. But how fast it goes in a straight line, in terms of the in-game performance parameters, doesn't have much to do with how well you turn. So essentially, in a mid-range engagement, in situations in which you have to relocate or micro-adjust your positioning, or adjust the angle of your tank, the position of your tank, to side scrape and make the most of your armor, this tank very much failed to deliver. And I guess another argument that suggests a different meta for playing this tank is to play this tank, as I've mentioned before, as a second line platform or even a third line tank. Stay a little further back, allow allies with more agility and with more armor to take hits for you and shoot over their shoulder and hurt enemies and make the most out of your good penetration, good alpha. But unfortunately, that doesn't really work, because if you ever get to play this tank, you will realize, the gun handling performance for the T30, especially with 155 millimeters, absolutely terrible, just absolutely atrocious. And more than anything, I would say that this trait is something that's supported by the soft stats much more than the hard stats. Because if you look at the hard stats in garage, you will see that aim time is decent, the aimed accuracy is decent, but in practice, you realize that if you have to move your tracks a little bit, if you have to turn a little bit, if you have to turn the turret a little bit, the amount of bloom you're gonna experience absolutely goes to the shitter. It just widens, it just dilates, like you wouldn't believe. It's kind of like a KV2, but except the KV2 doesn't really rely on armor-piercing ammunition. The KV2 can just derp the enemy with HE, and it sometimes doesn't even have to hit. You can land closely to the enemy and you splash them and do your work anyways. Not to mention the KV2 is already a tier 6, so you're dealing with enemies with far less armor and such a flaw in the way your tank performs is far less of an issue. So essentially, if you have to play further back, your gun is simply not just gonna behave. I've had so many experience, or much rather so much experience, in which I will be less than 50 meters away from the enemy. I will fully aim my gun, despite the bloom. I'll aim carefully, and my shot will just simply miss. And don't even think about trying to hit enemies' weak spots, because if it does hit, it's just pure luck. It's absolutely not something you want to rely on, because the RNG for this gun is just like a shitty slot machine in Vegas that's kind of rigged, and it just wouldn't pay you. It's utterly terrible. And unfortunately, even if you realize such a shortfall when it comes to the way the gun perform, and you decide to suck it up and play from the front, take the risk of taking hits and being forced into brawling situations in which your tank will be too clumsy to react. This gun still doesn't behave. Sure, you might be up in the enemy's face, but sometimes you will still miss anyways. Sometimes the RNG will kind of troll you and allow your shot to hit a small patch of extremely well armored part of the enemy's tank, such as the gun mantlet or the turret front when you're going for the hull. As I have mentioned before, one reason why a lot of people play this tank is the fact that it has 750 alpha and it has almost 280 millimeter penetration. But in practice, those two traits are not gonna save you, because sure, you have 750 alpha, but your DPM is kind of shitty. The tank reloads more than 16 seconds. It's very much close to 17 seconds. And you have two loaders. But that reload is very tricky, because it means if you're engaging the enemy in long distance, most likely you're not going to hit. And if you do hit, most likely in the process you have to expose yourself. But in the time being, you're going to have a hard time pulling yourself back into cover, because how slow this tank is at turning and how slow this tank is at moving, especially in reverse. So most likely most enemies will most probably get 2 or even 3 shots into your tank before you're able to reload for your second shot. So in terms of the amount of damage done and the amount of health lost, it's usually a bad trade. And obviously, if you're stuck on a city map and you're peek booming and you're essentially treating shots with enemy heavies in close range, then I can tell you almost certainly most of them will be able to get 2 shots into you while you can only shoot them 1 time. And this is all while they can consistently and reliably penetrate and do damage. Well, your penetration RNG might also troll you and not allow you to do much. Because ultimately, enemy tanks such as, the STI or the E75 that you see at this tier, and, quite frankly, something like the Mauser E100 or the Japanese heavies you routinely see in this tank, still have sufficient armor to frustrate and troll your shot and marginalize its penetration. But in return, your 100mm of penetration in the upper plate is not going to stop whatever they're going to hit you with. So much so that, sometimes and at times, the derp guns you see on the Japanese heavies will sometimes just outright penetrate your tank and do a completely ridiculous amount of damage, and especially to the modules. Speaking of which, another thing to note is the fact that, consider how clumsy this tank is. You're very much reliant on a good driver. A driver with off-road driving skill, a driver with clutch braking skill. But then and again, the driver sits in the extremely vulnerable part of the tank, which is the hull. And I noticed many enemies will know where to aim to hit the guy. So, usually, even fairly early on in the engagement, the driver will be killed. And you can heal him, but, more likely than anything, he'll be hit and killed again. And this tank with a dead driver, it's just ridiculous. It's absolutely beyond clumsy. And of course, aside from the driver being vulnerable, I will say that, the fuel tanks and the engine for this tank is also very vulnerable. Because, sometimes in order to protect your vulnerable frontal hull, you're going to want to side scrape. But if you do side scrape, ultimately you only have tracks and 75mm penetration at a tier, at which, many of the enemies have well over 250mm penetration, or, they can essentially double overmatch your side. And I would say that's, really a bad situation, and really, a bad mix of things, because the T30, as with many American tanks in this historical era, still used gasoline as a fuel for their engine, which is, represented with a 20% fire chance in game. So I have burned quite a few times in this tank. And of course, the classical vulnerability to artillery indirect fire trait this tank shares with many American tanks still remain. So sometimes arty will hit you and you cook up like a fucking barbecue. It is what it is. Another thing about the T30 is the fact that a lot of people say that, if you're not doing well in the T30 and if you are not staying safe in the T30, it's because, you're a noob and, you don't know how to, make the use of the tank's good turret and go hold down. And sure, having a turret that's about 300mm effective on the T30 as it is on the T34 and T29, it's definitely an important asset that you can make use of at times. But that's not really a trait that will be an end all to what you can do in this tank and how you can make things work. Because sure, you do have 300mm of armor in front of your turret, and the gunman is very solid. But at the end of the day, your cheeks are vulnerable if you are slightly off axis, at least with a rotational angle. And so enemy with 200mm of penetrations can sometimes get lucky and go through your cheeks. And the commander's hatch, even though it's small, quite frankly much smaller than M13s, can still be hit even by lower tiers. And another thing to note about the T30 is the fact that, unlike the M13, you do not have a reliable upper plate. So, sometimes you might be trying to go hold down and peek over a reed. But, even if you expose your upper hull a little bit, which is only 100mm, most likely the enemies will just simply go right through. And aside from the fact that the tank is very slow to reverse, and very slow to accelerate, and very slow to turn, another thing you will notice is that its turret rotation is also terrible. So sometimes you might want to rotate your turret one way to engage my enemy, but then readjust its angle to bounce enemies from another direction. And most likely because it's so clumsy, that just won't happen, unfortunately. And unfortunately, I believe the turret also has a fairly sizable ammo rack module. So sometimes if you do get hit on the side of your turret, enemies can open rack you. And sometimes kill your loader, which the tank has too. In a sense, I kind of believe the T30 is a bit of a relic from the earlier days of tanks, because it is. Obviously, this happened before I started playing tanks, but the T30 at one point used to be the Tier 10 American heavy tank, coming off the T34 at Tier 9, which is now Tier 8, and the T32 at Tier 8 and T29 at Tier 7. So ultimately the tank's been in game for a long time. Now obviously it kind of got nerfed and readjusted, and when it got converted into being a Tier 9 tank destroyer. And I guess certain perhaps deliberate attempts to micro-adjust and even contain or even marginalize the tank's performance, that that was a part of, or should I say a result of wargaming's design, if you will, at the earlier point of the game's history, might no longer be ideal for what this tank's meant to be at this point. Because if you look at it this way, since the T30 essentially have the same hull as the T29, and sure, you might have a heavier gun. The turret may be slightly different, as as shown in the model. It doesn't have the rangefinder the T29 has. But then and again, the T30 also has a more powerful engine. I believe the engine has 860 horsepower versus the 810 on the T29. But I think that kind of performance is not really effectively showcased in the way the tank performed in game. In a sense, I believe wargaming kind of artificially gave the tank higher ground resistance just simply because it's a tank destroyer. Come to think of it, if the mobility of the T30 can essentially be like a T29 with a correspondingly heavier gun, but also a more powerful engine, that more or less, balance this out as about as agile as the T29. Then the agility situation with the T30 would not be that much of a problem. As with the gun handling situation is concerned, I do believe one way to consider better adjusting and better accommodating this tank in today's metagame is to perhaps allow this tank to mount a vertical stabilizer, very much like the T34 and T29 can. Because ultimately they're the same tank, it's just with a different gun, and it's not really physically impossible in practice for such a thing to happen. Sure, I believe earlier in game's history, perhaps wargaming thought this thing has higher penetration and a lot of alpha. Perhaps we should give it derpier handling and not allow it to have a vertical stabilizer to promote a campier and more passive gameplay style, if you will. But in this day and age, especially consider the tank's armor and consider the tank's mobility, to be honest, I don't think such a design parameters it's reasonable anymore. And as you can see in my replays in today's video, essentially there are 5 replays that were first class and 1 replays that was ace tanker. You will see that, you know, the player's performance, the player's awareness, the player's mastery of the equipment and the metagame and strategies and tactics in the game doesn't matter so much when you're playing the T30, because, you know, the biggest variable, the biggest adjustable parameter, you know, the biggest X factor in the way this tank performs is essentially its fucking RNG. Cause, you know, how you shoot, where you shoot, how well you have aim, where you have aim, how you have micro adjusted your position, and, you know, your usage of the tank doesn't matter so much, because the gun will just do its own thing. It's not gonna listen to you. It doesn't really respond to, you know, good practice on part of the player. You know, stop your track, stop turning, aim well, wait until the boom minimizes. It doesn't really fucking matter. And, you know, in terms of penetration, in terms of what actually damage is done, you know, the RNG is also very shitty. Because, you know, as you can see, I had a shot of the fully exposed flat side of the IS, and my shot would fly over various obstacles and only be eaten by the enemy's tracks. So, you know, it's very fortunate in the sense that, you know, your job as a tanker is to take your time and be there and, you know, pull the trigger and hope for the best.
Enemy armor is destroyed.
But, you know, end of the day, you know, it's not really up to you. It's kind of like, you know, if you want to have a good game, you have to pray to Jesus and hope it works, and most of the time it doesn't. What a shame. As you can see, RNG trolls me again. Fully aimed, armor piercing with 280mm penetration. He's the Ryan Metal Borsig on the side. And that tank only has about as much armor as a fucking soda can. Shot goes to his tracks. Track eats it, essentially takes no visible damage. You know, that shot, even without any explosive filler, would have in real life completely mangled his tank. His tank would be made of fucking scrap afterward. But nope. Goes into the track. Track looks good as fucking new. I mean, the reality, the guy can probably just uninstall his fucking tracks and put it on eBay and sell it for pretty good money. It's ridiculous. It's kind of like, you know, the RNG in this tank is designed by a masochist, or much better, a sadist as well, and hopes that, you know, you're gonna jump on board the bandwagon and, you know, join their fucking party. It's insane. And as you can see right now, I'm in an endgame situation. That was 1 versus 3, and now I'm down to 1 versus 2 on Stalingrad of all maps. Not that the Americans haven't really fought here before in real life. Ultimately, this is a bad situation for the T30, because, you know, another thing to note about the way Wargaming has balanced tank destroyers, perhaps in response to some of the higher skill ceiling tanks that were designated tank destroyers, such as, you know, the E25 or the old Waffle Tractor, is that, you know, Wargaming kind of nerfed their vision, their spotting range. You know, I believe the T30 has significantly under 400 meters worth of vision. It might be 380, but I have to go back and check. But, you know, when you're in an endgame scenario, your tank is kind of relatively blind. So there's a chance that enemies might be able to see you before you see them, and they can engage you if the situation is desirable, such as they can outtrade you, or you have less health in them. But much rather, they can also know your positions and know your movement and know your intentions and try to outmaneuver you. And that's obviously something that the T30 is not really good at countering. Because the reality is that most tanks this tank sees at its tier are less clumsy and more agile. I mean, you can probably count with your fingers about how many tanks at tier 9 that are clumsier than the T30. Maybe the Japanese Type 4, maybe, as a pretty big maybe, the Mausgen German tier 9 that come before the mouth after the new tech tree adjustment. But if you compare between this and other tanks such as the ML3, sure, ML3 is clumsy, but this is worse. Or the E75. The E75 is actually a lot better. Or the STI.
Enemy vehicle destroyed.
So it's a shame that not only you have no armor, your gun don't behave, your tank's kind of blind, but most enemies can just simply drive in circles around you and taunt you as you die. And as you can see, towards the end of that game, I essentially have to pray to RNGesus and hopes that I'll hit the enemy, because the enemy is a Swedish tank destroyer with very high DPM. And if I sit there and let him hit me, I won't last. But if I fully aim, most likely in the time being, the enemy will have taken cover or readjusted his position or shot me. And obviously the bloom situation of any given tank does not only deal with how fast the tank can accelerate and reverse and turn, or turn its own turret, but much rather, it's also a very important tactical consideration, because sometimes you might be engaging enemies that are moving, that might be going in and out of cover, that might be relocating between different covers. But when you're in the T30, you have to make a lead and adjust your aim and try to follow the movement of the enemy. Then your bloom situation goes to absolutely utter shit. It just won't behave, and most likely you won't hit the enemy. If you do, then your prayer has been answered, but that's not a reliable thing, and quite frankly probably will never be. Perhaps until when Wargaming realize there's a problem with this tank and they have to do something about it. So I guess for today's fifth replay, I'm on Swamp. I decided to go to the north side of the map from the north cap rather than the south side, because I'm realizing this map is still not balanced, and the brawling corner in the southwestern edge of the map very much favor the south team versus the north team, because they essentially have multiple positions in which tanks can take up overwatch positions and shoot up anybody who peeks from the north. Meanwhile, most tanks on the north side are essentially funneled into a kill zone that's vulnerable and prone to be shot up from multiple sides. But it's really not a good trade-off for me in my tank, because if you do go south, then you are essentially allowing the enemy to exploit the weak armor for your tank, and to a lesser extent the relatively inferior mobility situation of your tank. But if you go north side, then you are more or less forced to engage enemies that are more mobile than you, and that are fast moving. And perhaps you have to engage enemies at longer range. And as I said before, this gun is not something to rely on in this situation. So when you're playing with the T30, you have to constantly think about how do I want to suffer. I'm going to be gimped in one way or another. What sort of gimping is more palatable? How can I cope with it? what's the better compromise? And ultimately, I think that's kind of sad because most tier 9 tanks I've played doesn't really put me in, that tight of a spot. Another thing to consider about T30 is the fact that, sure, as I have mentioned before, you're able to, perhaps make use of your top turret and, stay hold down. But, in this day and age, especially after the artillery parameter adjustment, it essentially means, when you are forced to, take up a static position, when you're forced to rely on your turret armor while hiding in your whole armor, and when you don't have the mobility to do anything else in that given situation, then you are essentially a very much a vulnerable and easy target to artillery strikes. Because where you are and where you will be become very much predictable to the enemies. And when your tank, even with a good crew at 100% and nobody dies, is already clumsy in the way it moves, and it's clumsy in the way it aims and shoots. You can only imagine how bad things will get if and when artillery does hit you. I would say that the newly introduced stunning effects you see with artilleries essentially renders the T30 into an utter pile of garbage, for better or for worse. I mean, sure, their alpha strike can get nerfed, but when you're driving the T30 and the artillery kept you trashed up, your tank kind of become as good as the pile of garbage. Because it's not gonna aim properly, the accuracy is completely shitter, it's not gonna pen, quite frankly it's probably not gonna hit, and your tank's already slow to begin with, but it's already going to be worse. I would say that a lot of times one thing will lead to another. So you'll get hit by one artillery and you'll get hit by another artillery. But sometimes if you play the T30 in such a static manner, that you could be perpetually stunned. And of course, other enemies can just simply farm off your health while the artillery were at it. But then again, if you choose to be more aggressive and if you choose to relocate, if you choose to be more proactive in the way you engage in enemies, you're already bad gun handling, your poor mobility, and your poor armor. It's already a huge problem to begin with, anyways. So once again, it's about how you want to suffer. As you can see right here, the T30 will do much better if it has help. Maybe enemy heavy to take a hit for you, bounce for you, somebody to keep the enemies occupied so you don't get hit, so that the enemies will be suppressed when you are slowly going in and out of cover. As you can see right now, I was engaging enemies on one flank, and I have to turn back and relocate and get an enemy in another flank. How slow it turns really shows how vulnerable this tank is. And as you can see, with my 16, almost 17-second reload, I will hit the enemy IS-3 once, and I will try to pull back. but my poor reverse speed and poor mobility and poor agility in general doesn't allow me to, really go into cover during the time period in which the enemy reloaded. And obviously because, he has a 122mm gun that reloads, around 11 seconds versus my, 16-17 second reload, he can just simply put another shell into me before, I was able to return fire. And of course, you can say that, in this situation, friendlies might and should be there to, suppress the enemies and keep them occupied and even kill the enemy for me and save me. But, this is ultimately World of Tanks, and, people are too incompetent and, too shitty and, quite frankly, too narcissistic to give a damn. Ultimately, I think this game, tells you about the way the world is more than anything, which is sad. So last but not the least, the very last replay for today's video is going to be on mines, and this is actually the first and only game I have ever gotten an ace tanker in the T30. In that regard, it was a bit of a surprise because ultimately, I only did 4.5k worth of damage, so give or take, it was around the same level of performance in my first class games. But perhaps, I kind of got lucky because relative to me, other players in the T30 didn't perform so well in this given time period, and that's how my performance was judged to be relatively superior, if you will. And I believe this replay also goes further to show that, you always need a degree of luck and good RNG in this T30 to do okay, unfortunately. So, as most people who are familiar with tanks, you probably remember Mines, which is a smaller map from even, your first day playing tanks, even in Tier 1. I would say that the hill in the middle of the map, where there are multiple mine entrances on this map, it's quite a big deal. Because, whoever takes the middle hill of the map can effectively provide overwatch and suppression fire over very much the entirety of the map. And the hill can also provide vision for artillery and tank destroyers that are staying further back. Speaking of tank destroyers that are staying further back, you can see that, I'm not doing that in the T30, even though the T30 is a tank destroyer. Partly because, if I was to camp essentially the back hill on the T30, there's no way my gun will behave. And you have to consider the fact that, your gun's not going to behave even though you got smooth ride, you got snapshot, and your crew is 100%. It goes to show how problematic, how far short this gun falls in that regard. So I guess in this situation, in a sense, I kind of locked out because my allies, the enemies, are forced into essentially a peek-a-booming situation against my tank. So it's kind of like one shot for one shot. But, as in the T30, if you somehow manage to not let enemies put 2 shots into you while you can only return 1, you might gain the upper hand just simply because the tank has more alpha. And of course, in this case, we are not even trading at all. But much rather, it's kind of like the enemies are simply trying to shoot anybody on my team that are exposed and they can get a shot into. So, that kind of spared me of having to take shots, and allows me to slowly wait out my reloads and, push shots into the enemies. And unfortunately, despite the fact that this tank has essentially about 30 or 20mm more penetration versus an equal tier heavy tank such as the E75 or STI or M03, that difference in terms of penetration is ultimately not enough to to allow your shot placement to be more flexible. Because for example, when I was engaging the E75, sure I have more penetration than equal tier heavy, but it doesn't mean that my gun will go through the upper plate of the E75 or the turret front of the E75. I still have to go for his lower plate or turret hatch or try to flank him to the sides. But consider the fact that my tank doesn't have armor, doesn't have mobility. That really put me in a bad spot. Versus how things would be if I was in an equal tier heavy. So in other words, the extra penetration is kind of like nothing. And as you can see previously, I bounced off the upper plate of the check tank. Sure, he might have locked out and kind of gave me his upper plate at auto bounce angle. But another thing to consider is the fact that my gun's bloom and my poor mobility versus his good mobility doesn't really allow me to fully aim, and the RNG on my gun doesn't really allow me to have a better shot placement. So it's really a difficult situation. As you can see right here, I kind of hesitated a little bit because, essentially the only part of your tank that can take a hit is the front of the turret. If you get hit anywhere else, you're gonna take damage. So I was contemplating for a bit about whether to go for the enemy on the left side or the right side, which one of the enemies will have the gun pointed at me. You'll see right now I totally locked out and managed to put a kill shot into the enemy's check tank, thanks to my RNG behaving for once. But you can imagine if that shot got eaten by his track or overflew him or got bounced by him at a funky angle, he can just simply sit there and empty his entire clip before I was able to put another shot into my chamber. Anyways, once again, bonus points for if you know where this track came from. It's from an old video game. I suppose most of you guys are probably too young for this, but it is what it is. Anyways, as you can see, for the first 5 games of today's video, I got first class and various awards, and it kind of shows how much damage you have to do to get a certain degree of mastery in this tank, and also the degree of profitability in this tank, which is marginally better than what you're used to in heavy tanks, because the big boomstick 155mm with a shitty RNG essentially has ammos that are marginally expensive on a piece by piece basis, but if you are lucky, they will do more damage per shot, and essentially leads to more profit to you. But as with everything else on this tank, it's not really something you want to count on, because you really can't. You just have to throw your arms up in the air and let it be. In a sense, I kind of secretly hope that the E4 will be a better tank with a better RNG. They'll kind of reasonably respond and reward to a player's proper input and dedicated performance. But it's wargaming, since there's no hard currency involved, I'm not dumping my credit card into this. I suspect they won't listen. But so is life, So I guess in the end, the ace tanker is bittersweet, if you will. You know, and now I'm on the fence about whether or not this tank should be sold, so I can move on to, you know, more interesting machines. Anyways, thanks for watching. Stay tuned. Until next time.